Wow, looks like it's up and running. What do you know? I'm out and about as usual, and I've been going back and forth on Twitter with some people about some issues. It's interesting. Scriptural stuff shows up every once in a while. And again, if you're not interested in talking about scriptural, spiritual things, you'll probably want to skip this video. But I think it's going to be interesting, again, as so many are, because it really does have a lot to do with where we are today and what's happening. Let me lower that a little bit so you can see a little better. I wasn't able to get a hold of Roosevelt, primarily because Roosevelt's probably in the middle of tax information, having to work on that. I haven't talked to Felicia on this thing today. Hi, thank you for the 5x5. She's gone through a little procedure and would probably not be up to it. And of course, I don't know if Jesse from BP Earthwatch or Kay Smalls or Liza Jean will come on, but regardless, I know I'm doing this a little early in the day today, and there are a couple of reasons for that on my own account. Not to say I won't. I need scotch, is that what you said? Not that I won't be able to do something tonight, but I had to take advantage of the time that I have here to do this now. So that's the reason why I'm doing it. So hopefully this will be interesting to you. Let me make a few comments, however, on a few things. If all of you know who Paul Craig Roberts is, he's been talking a lot about the situation with Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. And he's been very upset that it seems like Russia doesn't know what it's doing, that it's stalling a lot. And I've talked about this, and I understand where Dr. Roberts is coming from, but he's a financial guy. He's not a tactician. He's not a military tactician, and one has to understand what the objectives are. I mean, none of us really do because we don't know what's in the Russians' mind entirely. But I am thoroughly convinced that it has nothing to do with taking over Poland or Ukraine or any of that. It's just taking over that eastern part of the Donbass and preventing Ukraine from becoming a military power. And really, at this point, unless NATO could resupply it, the Ukrainian army is done. Okay, that's the way it is now. But the big question is, why did Putin pull away from Kiev or Kiev, however they say it these days? Well, because that wasn't an objective. As I pointed out very early on, that wasn't the objective to take over the capital. That has a lot of problems associated with it, and they really weren't interested in that. They were interested in making a show of force, as I called it the other day, a feint or a reconnaissance in force, that kind of thing, to show, first of all, see what the strength of the opposing army is, and also to send a message. And that was all done. They didn't run away and get defeated. That's not what happened. I think that was part of the plan. Their concern is everything on the eastern side of Ukraine, and like we talked about before, the situation with NATO. And that all hasn't been resolved yet. They apparently were in some peace talks, and then that got derailed again. But this is a game that's going to be played for quite some time. As it stands right now, I'd say that the Russians are thoroughly in charge. Okay, that's the way I look at it. And I do think that whether Putin was a part of the WEF at one time or whether he's on the stage today just causing financial chaos in the West, the fact of the matter is he's attacked the biolabs, he's gotten control of them, they've got the information, they're taking it to the UN. Our evil politicians and corporations and leaders in our country and in NATO are the ones that spurred this whole thing, as I've explained. And of course, the corruption with using Ukraine as a money laundering area for people like Biden, etc. The biolabs where they were obviously doing genetic engineering there. A lot of things that could, if that was happening on our border, hopefully, although sometimes I wonder, I don't think our DOD or our executive branch is interested in protecting the American people at all. But theoretically, if something was going on like that on our border, we'd be concerned about it too. And he gave them 8 years to do something about it. Now, okay, yeah, it could all be part of the play, but at this point in time, I still don't think that that's the case. I think that Putin has pulled back from that. That's my idea. Okay, yeah. all of you are keeping tabs on this stuff, so I'm sure you understand. The other thing is, of course, that there's a lot more information coming out about the GMIs and about the well, how can I say this without alerting the AI? Uh, the uh, the really small circuitry, let's put it that way. There's more information coming out about that. More researchers are finding this in many different countries, many continents. If you're following that, you should know that by now and the dangers that are involved in that. Interestingly, I saw a video just yesterday where when they're looking at these things through a microscope and they're geometric structures, they're definitely not natural. And they took great pains to make sure they didn't contaminate the yeah, it's that TGS source exactly. If everybody can see that, the graph and the een, okay, talking so that I don't alert the AI here. When they brought cell phones close to it and keyed the cell phone to send, or I guess it was just to bring the cell phone near, if there was any kind of transmission, these little circuitries would light up. And that was common across the entire spectrum of these geometric circuitry figures. Definitely, this is all about transhumanism, about changing us from what we are. And I have a lot of questions philosophically about that. I don't know if you are thinking these things, but as I pointed out some time ago, and we're going to kind of touch on it here, these people are trying to play God or be the devils to usurp God's position, however you want to view God. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But it's interesting that God allowed this situation to happen. Of course, it's allegorical in some sense, with the Adam and Eve story where they were subjected to this exterior force that they took in and then contaminated themselves and caused the fall, and then were separated from God and all of that. I talked about that on the 8th day video that I did and some other videos. And the fact that was giving humans more knowledge, supposedly. Oh, you're not going to die. You'll be as gods to know the difference between good and evil. So it was a promise of more knowledge, that kind of thing. And a lot of you know about the fallen angels and all of that. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. They're trying to change our genetics like they did before, as we've talked about. They're trying to actually take over from God. I heard a guy by the name of Harari, and I don't want to say his whole name again, but he's associated with KS, the Klaus, the Schwaber, right? And he says that they don't believe in a God, that they are the intelligent designers. Well, wow, what hypocrisy and arrogance, that there couldn't be an intelligent design that did all of this for us, but they're going to be the intelligent design to change us and to change all DNA and genetic codes on the earth of everything, really. And that's what we've suspected for a long time. They want to destroy God's creation and make it in their own image. That's exactly opposite to what the commandments call for. It is exactly why the flood occurred, as far as the story of that, the destruction of the Tower of Babel, all of these things. So at any rate, we're in a lot of trouble. You really do need to pray every day, because if nothing else, you want God to write his law, his mind in your mind and in your heart. As he's talked about David was a man after his own heart, and God wants to write that in our hearts and our minds. So, yeah, this is kind of a spiritual discussion, but it certainly has a lot of application to our world situation right now. This is LaCroix, key lime. I'm not advertising. Might as well, though. It's just sparkling water. It's soda water with some key lime natural flavoring. It's really pretty good. Kind of creamy. Okay, so that's my real quick discussion on the world situation. Of course, our own leaders are basically selling us down the river. We should have our own energy, if for no other reason than our national security. But of course, national security is no longer an issue. It's all about the New World Order and the world government. We know about the World Government Forum that just took place, and they're all talking about it now. And none of our leaders are opposing this at all, which should make you wonder why. Don't they want their own power? What is it that they're afraid of that they're willing to sell themselves out to this and their countrymen? There's an evil force at work here, something extremely powerful. And as I talked about the other day with Jacob Israel, the Antichrist spirit is something that's put in the temple of God, which is us, okay, the way we embrace wickedness, or the Spirit of Christ, and we embrace the goodness, right? And those two forces are at work. But there, I still think also that there is an actual entity that's influencing these people, very powerful one, and also his or its representative here that we would call the AC or the Antichrist. So we are in the middle of this thing. There's no doubt about it, and it's getting tougher all the time. Okay, yeah, prep, pray, stay out of the way. Thank you. Below hell is active in and around the people. Okay, let me get into the rest of the meat of this, and believe it or not, it does tie in. Like I said, I was having this discussion on Twitter with some folks about creation, what creation is, how that actually is explained in Genesis, but we interpret it according to our Western values and understandings, and we've been doing that for nearly 2,000 years. We're not going back and looking at how it's actually considered back in those days. What's that, Roy? I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but Lucifer is God, and vice versa, the Bible. Well, I'd get into that. I can understand that argument. Lucifer, of course, is not a name. It's just Latin meaning light bearer. That's not even his name. And I think you should know that. But I'm not going there today, okay? I have a lot of suspicions about what's happened. For instance, the Christians, as I've talked about so often, pushing this thing that sex is bad and the relationship between men and women, there are a lot of problems with Christian traditions and Christian teachings that have actually damaged mankind. I recognize that. And I'm not saying that all the rest of them are good. I'm not saying paganism is good or all that, but we're going to talk about some things today that will show you that this isn't how it was in ancient Hebraic times, at the very least, that some kind of a change did occur later, okay? All right, so let me move away from all of that. Not any amount can snuff out light. Roger Courtier, yeah. I don't think that's been verified yet. But the fact that the CIA and the DOD has not said that that's fake news, at least they hadn't as of a few hours ago, leads you to believe that there's something to it. So yeah, the Russians captured Major General Roger Courtier, American general, in Kiev, apparently. Bad form on Biden's and the DOD's part, but it doesn't surprise me at all. So we'll watch and see if what happens with that. That could really be a big change up there. Sorry, I keep coming so close. What is the black pad on the table? Oh, you guys you're trying to jump ahead of me now. War is going to happen now. I don't know about that. Not the way we think. We've been in a war for a long time. And remember, you're the enemy. The people are the enemy of their own countries and nations. They're separate nations. The leaders and the governments of those nations consider their own people more of an enemy than they do any exterior threat or consideration. For instance, Russia is nowhere near considered the enemy that you are when you go into the halls of power. They just use Russia as a way to make you afraid. You see what I'm saying? All right. Let's talk about Genesis 1. And you might say, oh, no, not that again. Well, there's a reason. Again, on Twitter, we were talking about the difference between, what is creation, and some people started bringing up, well, there's Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end and all this. Anyway, I don't know if you've been following me on Twitter, but I wanted to show you some things so that you could see how you fit in to the world today and what we really are. This isn't your first time in a situation like this. I say like this. This is probably like no other situation than your spirit has ever been in, but you've been in other situations, and I'm going to show you that. Some time ago, BP Earthwatch, Jesse, and I discussed on our live stream the flower of life. You can see that well? Very good. How did you know that? Who is that? Jude Hedo 69. Yeah, it's a flower of life. And I thank you for recognizing it. And a lot of people say, that's a New Age symbol. Well, actually, it's been around in many cultures for many thousands of years. Egyptian, for one. Assyrian, which you might say, well, they were pagans. But the principles are the same. And a lot of this that we've been told, these different societies were evil, really weren't. They were just trying to find their way. They become evil just like we did. We were supposed to be a Christian nation, right? 1,000 years from now, people are going to go back and say if we're still around, but I'm talking about historically, looking at the United States and say, wow, they were wicked, they were evil, they deserved to be destroyed. But we were Christian at one time. Well, that was the same for all these other people. They were all Shemites. That's another story. Anyway, very good. Yeah, we're going to talk about that, and it has to do with what I've got here up on the board. So, if you look at Genesis 1, there's some interesting things that happen, and I'm gonna read it to you. Not the whole thing, just a couple things. I want you to go back and read Genesis 1 because we're going to talk about void and form. Because God found, right? Let me read this to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Oh, that's interesting. And the earth was without form. I've got it up here in the Hebrew and the English. And void, and I've got that in the Hebrew and in English. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Well, I thought that it was formless and void, but now he's saying there's waters there. What's going on? And as you read on further, listen to this. Okay, this is very important because in the first verse there it says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." Now, in Hebrew, that's Bereshit. Okay, and the entire story of this world is in that one word, Bereshit. All right, I did that once on a video a long time ago, but what I'm really homing in here on is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, not the other way around. It doesn't say, and God created the earth and heavens. He said he created the heaven and the earth. Now listen to this. So we go through and we divide the light from the dark, and that's the first day, and that has to do with something more than just the light that you see, but that's not the issue for today. And then what happens? And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. So something was already existing there, the waters. And let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. Oh. And then he does the dry land and he calls that earth. Isn't that interesting? Well, let's look at a couple things. No, I'm not going to answer all your questions today. I mean, as far as being able to resolve it is too big of an issue, but this is what came up in our discussion on Twitter, and that's why I wanted to cover it here. You know that in Revelation, Jesus is said to say that he is the Alpha and Omega, and that's the Greek, as I've talked about before, for the Aleph and the Tav in Hebrew. Alpha and Omega, the first letter, the last letter in Greek, and Aleph Tav, the first and last letters in Hebrew. That's the same thing, okay? What was it saying? All right. In Western thought, and this is kind of, doesn't really follow what I'm doing here, but I didn't have anywhere else to draw it. Most Westerners think linearly, and this is what I'd said is the problem with when we search the scriptures. We don't understand Middle Eastern thought is circular, not linear. We always in the West think linearly. So we think that when Jesus says that he's the beginning and the end, he's the Alpha and Omega, the Aleph and Tav, we're thinking linearly, that he started things and he will end things. That's what we interpret, and we're entirely incorrect. And a lot of the ancient cultures understood it the way I'm going to tell you now. And yes, it does have to do with the flower of life. What Jesus was really saying is it's a circle. He's the beginning and the end in one continuous circle. And no matter where you are on here, this is a beginning and this is an end. This is a beginning and that's an end. And no matter where you turn that, you can, and where you land on it, it's a beginning and it's an end. And that's an important understanding because it then gives you a better insight into what eternity really is, and where this particular eighth day that we're in fits in to this. Okay? And we're going to talk about that with this in just a minute. Let me just go ahead and diverge here for a minute to these concepts here. Create is the word bara in Hebrew. It's word 1254 in Strong's Hebrew side. And it doesn't mean to create ex nihilo. In other words, out of nothing. It means to take what's there and form it into something, like making pottery or something like that. It doesn't, think God thinks and poof, something comes into existence. That's a Greek thought. That's not a Hebraic or an original biblical thought. Okay? That's something that came along later. Form, because in the first chapter of Genesis says there that in the first couple of verses that, and the earth was out form and void. The word for form is word 8414 in Strong's. And look at this, it's kind of interesting. It's tuhu, and there it is in the Hebrew. Tuhu, tav, he, vav, or wow. And I told you that these letters mean specific things, and that's how we can understand really more about the internal idea of what form means in the Hebrew. Because in the Hebrew it means quite a bit different than what it means in English. And then, of course, the word void, it's word 922 in Strong's in the Hebrew side, and it's beit he wah, and it's pronounced boo-hoo. Have you ever heard somebody say that? Oh, boo-hoo, boo-hoo, boo-hoo. Well, guess where it comes from? It means you're void. You're crying over nothing. Boo-hoo. It really did come from that. Okay, so you guys have been saying, oh, boo-hoo, to talk about somebody crying. You're actually going back to the Hebrew and using an old idiom from the Hebrew, which has to do with void or emptiness. Now, what does it mean to be empty? It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that it hasn't been put to use yet. That's really what it means. And this goes back to what Jesse and I were talking about that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that the flood of Noah's time was not the first time that had happened, that had happened before. Meaning, not necessarily that the actual waters had happened, although I think Jesse would argue that point, but that there had been prior civilizations, prior inhabitants here before, and that it got wiped out in some way, shape, or form, and that it was restarted again. That basically the God came and then started to reorganize things again. And that's really what happened. And we can show that, again, by the principle of alpha and omega, aleph, tav, the beginning and the end. And again, it's not a linear line that has a beginning here, like the creation of the universe started here. It came out of nothing, not the way it happened, and then it's going to have an end. No, that's not how it works. It's a circle. Now, somebody correctly viewed this as being the flower of life. As I said, this has been around for many centuries. It's not just a New Age symbol, but symbols get appropriated by others. And that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, depending upon how it's used. Before I talk about this, let me talk about Carl Jung. And you might say, oh no, don't talk about Carl Jung. He was a psychiatrist who had been a protege of Freud, and then kind of had his own philosophy and things. And no matter how you feel about psychiatry, that's not the point. Carl Jung, in his studies, in his research, revealed or found out that apparently there are things called family systems that move through time. If you want to use this, they may show up here, they may show up here, or it may be outside this in another reality, okay? But that these family systems move together. It's not just an individual. And I know you're going to say, well, that's reincarnation. Well, we're going to talk about that kind of. I don't want to get down that rabbit hole. But you did exist before in a place very similar to this, doing very similar things. And so the idea of a family system moving together and having these experiences together, and yeah, there can be changes here and there, but basically it's a family system that moves through eternity. That was a Jungian idea. He probably got it from this, Flower of Life. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but there's my circle, alpha and omega, the beginning and the end. It's not linear. The flower of life is a form. You can see all the different circles in here. First of all, you've got the big one, right? And then you have these ones on the inside, like this one here, this one here, this one here. And you'll notice they connect. They're not separate. Everything is connected to everything else. Okay? What that's saying is that this is the family systems moving together. And that when they leave this one, it's connected still to this one over here, which is connected to this one over here. And these are the connection points right there. Okay? I don't know if you can see that, but this idea, the flower of life, is also, it's not just New Age. It's what Jesus was saying with the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. And these circles, as I put the title of this video up, says what? There's nothing new under the sun. Solomon said that, right? There's nothing new under the sun, which is true. The only difference is that you're going through different phases of life. And life isn't just what's here. But this is what Satan's trying to destroy, are those interrelationships, especially, as I've mentioned about so many times, the problem with the destruction of the relationship between men and women. That's the problem. So I don't know if that's interesting to anybody, but hopefully one of these days, mankind will get their heads out of their collective rear ends and throw off these bad rulers who are trying to destroy them, who are listening to the influence of the evil, the same evil that did what happened in the Garden of Eden, the same evil that dealt with the Tower of Babel, and realize that you're moving together, and that's what's really important. And the flower of life shows that everything is connected to everything else. And in one Aleph Tav, beginning and end. That doesn't mean that you had a beginning and that you had an end. Someone wrote yesterday, well, if there was no beginning and no end, then that means that you were never really created and you will never really die. Eternity is something that you're in right now. You're just going through a particular phase of one of these circles. But you're about ready to go to another one. Now, I do believe in the resurrection. I think that the purpose of this existence here, as I've talked about before, is to unite spirit, which is what the first chapter of Genesis is really about, and the physical. So we're talking about that the fullness of existence is having your spirit united with a material form so that you have your individual conscience in something that works in relationship to others. And you can look at that any way you want, for instance, the husband-wife relationship. But if you look at chapter 1 in Genesis, it says all these things that God was creating. And then in chapter 2, it says something else. And it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. And the seventh day God ended his work and rested, right? And then it says in verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens, not just heaven. You see, heavens. In chapter 1, it said this was, and God made, it says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And in the Hebrew, that's correct. Heaven is actually Hashemayim, okay? But at any rate, in verse 7, it says, and God made the firmament, divided the waters, right? And he called the firmament heaven, and the dry land he called earth. Well, now, in verse 4 of chapter 2, it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. So in other words, they're not the same story. And I've talked about that before, and I won't belabor the point today, other than to say chapter 1 is the spiritual creation, and chapter 2 is where we start with the as it says, God took man and formed him out of the dust of the ground. In a normal way, you're made out of the dust of the ground. That's exactly how you were made, through the relationship of a man and a woman, right? And that then God breathed his spirit into that man, and man became a living soul. That's why I constantly do not associate your spirit as a soul. The soul is the spirit and the body united. Okay? And so that's why I make that difference all the time. A lot of people talk about the soul, and they mean that's the spirit that's in you, but in reality it's your body and your spirit united. That's the soul of man, and that's exactly what Genesis 2 says, if you believe the biblical narrative. Okay? For those of you who don't, this is probably entirely of no interest to you, but at least for that, you need to know. Okay? All right. Well, I've got to get going, being with some family. There's still some issues that are going on, and we're trying to take care of that. So I just wanted to show you how these things are related. As I said in my book, The Crimson Thread, the idea of a man who would make a sacrifice for the rest of mankind, at least his own family, is something that's been in the thought of men for a very long time. It wasn't new just in Christianity. It had been around. For instance, there was Dionysus, for instance. There was Asclepius. There was Mithra, and on back. Okay? And the flower of life, which is, again, the Alpha and Omega, showing that there's nothing new under the sun and that there's an eternity of these things happening, isn't just a pagan symbol. It's actually a symbol that we can all relate to, and it tells us a lot about who and what we are. Okay? I can't stay because I got to go, but I just wanted to give you that information today, okay? All right. Maybe we can talk a little later. Hey, thanks a lot out here.